we go. This gets turned on, and suddenly I am very, very loud. It's a great pleasure of being an American that you're loud anyway, and so Americans amplified are even it's all about traveling. I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm talking to a lot of people who know me very, very well and who have heard things that I have had to say in the past. Also, hello to you viewers at home. This is apparently being filmed for posterity as well. And what I thought I would share with you today is both some of the ways that we have been approaching thinking about inventing Europe and the way our thoughts have developed as we've gone on, but also thinking about how we can develop this as a space for new contexts, new ideas, and what is special about inventing Europe. So I thought I would start, in spite of the fact that all of you know me, I thought about sort of thinking through the way we all think through the digital space by introducing myself to you, again, but this time as it says right there, as a digital object. So through the biggest cultural repository in the world, through Google, if you look for me, you will find out that I am one of the richest men in Britain. That's the Sunday Times rich list. I'm worth about $65 million. Pounds, in fact. Actually, no, that's not me. If you keep looking, I'm actually in the National Portrait Gallery, but unfortunately you can already tell that that's not me. And as much as I like you all and I'm an expert in a number of things, there are certain problems I can't actually help you with. And in fact, in spite of my best efforts, I can't even save turtles. So no, that's not me either. And if you keep Googling, you'll find performance art in Atlanta, Georgia, and sure enough, there's an Alec Badenoch involved. And yeah, that was me. If you keep going, the city of Bournemouth in England, there was a budding young journalist named Rayam Al-Farah, interviewed the British Council officer named Alec Badenoch, opining, as I very often do. And yes, in fact, that was me. And in fact, this young journalist went on to become a UN spokesman in Iraq. That was me. And of course, if you keep Googling, you suddenly come across a book about chocolate, written by this guy named Alexander Badenoch, and here it is translated into Arabic. Yeah, that was me. And if if you get off the Google, as George W. Bush calls it, and go looking in deeper databases, you can actually go looking in the Siri database of the Museum Center Fabriki of the town of Tampere, and there I am as a visual object. I've been collected. I'm a thing. It's great. I love it. So I've gone from being a curator to an object, running around in cyberspace. So yes, that's me too. So what do we make of all of this? On the one hand, there probably is a connection between all of these various Alexander Badenochs. I don't know what it is. But what the internet is very good at is suggesting that there are connections. This is what Europeana can do. If you type in Alexander Badenoch, you might find all of these people in one way, shape, or form. And there is probably a story to be told about the Scottish diaspora. It's great for driving curiosity, to suggesting connections. But there's something else. And over here on this side, there's a story. And there's probably somebody who's very good at telling you that story. In this case, it's probably me. If my wife were to tell this story, it would be a little bit different. Chemo would have another version on it, of course, for some of these things. There are lots of stories to be told about how this one digital object has created all of these various connections in all of these various countries. And I'm telling you this partially, of course, to get a laugh of a Wednesday morning. That's a very good idea. But the other thing is, it's about how we think about what digital objects are and the two things that they can do. They can suggest connections, create new places to explore, but they can also go in depth and raise questions, raise stories, and really start to show you bits of transnational circulation. And it's this latter that I'm going to talk about today, because that's the work that we are trying to do in inventing Europe within this broader landscape of the connections of the internet. So this is what we're about. And one way or another, what it boils down to is that digital objects don't need to be seen as destinations. They're not a place that you go to, that they're not your final resting point. We need to mobilize them and think of them as connections, things that sit in a vast web of connections, and it's those connections that are the story that are to be told around them, and those are the stories that we're trying to tell. And this all grew out of discoveries that digital objects did have lots of transnational stories running through them. And here's one that I picked out. You have already become acquainted with the fact that I know something about chocolate, and so here's something I picked out of the Science and Society Picture Library at the British Museum. It's a postcard put out by the Liebig firm. It's actually advertising Liebig's meat extract, but it's showing an industrial process, a cacao press, or the process of pressing cacao. And of course, you've got a cacao press invented in this fine country in cooperation with a German firm. Liebig, of course, was also a German firm. If you look closely, this is in French, and of course, it's being collected by the Science Museum. And this is related, in fact, to, we've got postcards like this in Inventing Europe, but we've drawn them, in fact, from the collection of the Deutsches Museum. They're in German, and they're showing Liebig's cows, but they're also showing lots of different things. What we are trying to do within Inventing Europe is come up with ways and encourage people to start to spin out these various stories from the objects, to go deeper, engage with them, ask new questions, and see them within different stories. And generally speaking, and this is actually a way that we've also been learning to teach with Inventing Europe, getting people to think of objects as existing in 4 different realms of connection. And in fact, these are 4 different ways of looking at what a digital object is. And the first of, so here we have our object itself sitting in the middle of these 4 realms. The first I probably don't need to tell, especially the people here in this room, about. It's about seeing things as an artifact, as a series of material relations. These are the forms of interpretation that, to be honest, I think everybody in this room is probably better at than I am. I try to do it myself. Spinning out the actual relationships that were happening around this card. Who designed it? How was it printed? Who bought them? What did they cost? What activities they show? And of course, there's a much bigger realm of connections surrounding them. Liebig himself, his laboratory, of course, and you can go to the Deutsches Museum and see a replica of Liebig's laboratory, lots of the famous chemistry equipment. All of these are working around and through this card, and we start to be able to make connections over borders simply by tracing out all of the things that are happening within one simple card by asking the right questions about what's happening here and how it crossed borders. But the other thing that is happening as digital objects are coming into circulation, a lot of what's happening is their original context is being erased, and I want to think a little bit more about what they bring with them as objects, things that were once collected as part of heritage collections, things that were once selected, things that were classified and placed in relation to what other objects. What are the forms of classification that are happening in institutional knowledge? And what are the kinds of stories that they're meant to tell? And of course, what is the information that's traveling with them, but what is the information that's currently not traveling with them? And how do we get that in depth? Sometimes this does get very in depth. This is the metadata that's traveling with this particular thing. You've actually got a large series of interpretation that is actually being able to show this in transnational circulation. It actually tells you how long these cards were printed. It actually tells you that the Liebig firm was eventually bought by Unilever. Again, the Dutch connection. It's always good to be here. So one of the questions is, what is the information that's traveling with them, and how can we put it in depth? But what isn't here is why this was collected. Who collected this? Who thought it was a good idea? And how did a French postcard end up in the collection of the Science Museum? And what were these practices? What are the remits? What is the institution actually doing? And what is the relationship of this object to an institution? And to think through this, I'm going to give you 3 objects. They're in 3 different collections. They were collected at different times. Do they actually tell different stories? Science Museum, the Imperial War Museum, and the Deutsches Museum. And what, of course, I'm talking about is a V2 rocket. How did these particular V2s get to where they are? What different stories are they being told? They're all in giant galleries, famous galleries. If you've ever stood under a V2 rocket and imagined it falling out of the sky, it's a very impressive thing. How is each one of these classified? How are they telling different stories? And how can we bring them together to see how they talk to each other? In two of these, they're being displayed as technology. In the middle, what is that doing there? What is the story that's being told? In the middle of London, the curators very often say they shouldn't be pointing up, they should be pointing down if you're displaying them in London. And of course, one of the things that we're trying to do is build bridges with academic research, the actual sorts of questions that you can ask of an object and see them being built into stories, how they can help answer historical questions. And of course, we're trying to build links with a growing body of scholarship to encourage people to come up with more. And the last thing I want to engage with as a media scientist, I think this is also very important, that we need to think more about how digital objects are being represented and what they have represented at various points in time, both in terms of how the digital object represents the physical object, how the objects within them are being portrayed initially. You know, what are they being mobilized to represent? What people are they representing? And what are the principles? And for this, I want to talk to, this is one of my favorite objects. We put it at the end of the tour on Europeans going into the world with cars and planes. And I thought at the very end of this exhibition, we also need to try to turn the camera around and see how people outside of Europe were viewing Europeans. It's a fascinating thing from the Institute of Tropical Science. At the same time, this is a problematic image for a number of reasons. For one, I don't know anything about the photographer. I'm very curious, but I can tell that it's part of a colonial collection. In fact, it's from 1938. It's by a Portuguese photographer. So even though this is, on the one hand, it's a representation made by a native artist of Europeans, but at the same time, it is a European collecting this object as a photo from a colonial position. And of course, now we are putting this in an exhibition as well. So there are loads of echoes of representation. And one of the questions is, who are the people that this is actually representing? And how can we bring those into the story that we're telling and make these echoes of representation visible to viewers? Because on the surface, here in this black and white photo, that's not necessarily obvious, but it's a form of translation. And this image has already crossed 3, 4 borders simply by being what it is. And the question is, how do we make those borders apparent again? How do we bring those out? And it's in 2 places at once. You can go visit it either on Inventing Europe, which I encourage you to do, or you can go back and visit it within its colonial context. And if you visit it there, you will see it, especially there are loads of photos from this photographer. If you visit it there, you will see photos of all over Africa, from Mozambique, from Angola, and it becomes a very, very different object as you start to see it as part of this colonial collection in ways that we're not necessarily able to show. So these are the 4 realms that we're dealing with, 4 realms of connection. And as we start to look at objects, I think it's very important to be able to show them how they exist in 3, maybe even all 4 of those realms at the same time. And that's the way we start to make Inventing Europe a place where objects, the word I was thinking of yesterday as we were thinking through it, that objects begin to become sticky. Stories begin to adhere to them. More voices come around them. Because what happens when they tend to circulate on the internet and in the digital realm, they very often come loose from their stories. And I think what we want to make of Inventing Europe is a place where they get deeper, where they get embedded in the stories, where you can't grab the one story without seeing the other one too, without wanting to take it further and expand all of its various networks. And I think that's what we can do. So I actually want to get away from the idea of contextualizing an object. Contextualizing an object is simply putting an object back where it was. And what we're doing is something far more active. What we're doing and what we need to do is translate objects. But also think of objects as translating themselves, as things that translate. We don't need to get into Bruno Latour very deeply here at all. But the point is that the objects themselves, two various things, coming back to this sort of duality of curator and object within the digital realm. On the one hand, we need to show how objects translate between these various realms of knowledge, to see how the sort of networks that objects work through translate between these realms of knowledge. That's one thing that we can do brilliantly within the site we have, especially, but doing this with a community of translators, to encourage a community of translators, to come up with a number of people within the same space that have ways of making their objects intelligible. To come back to sort of the story of inventing Europe, we hit sort of a logjam once we designed the original stories. We got to a point, we had written storyboards and thought, okay, now we just need to put objects in them. And none of the objects we were finding were actually coming from the collections of our partners. And we couldn't figure out how to translate what we were trying to do into the collections that we were trying to mobilize within Inventing Europe. And we finally figured out how to solve this by going to visit, by actually getting guided tours around the collections from the curators, seeing how the objects worked in situ, but also the curators learned by translating their collections for us, by beginning to spin out the stories, beginning to tell us what was interesting about what they had there in their own space. And it was actually as the local stories began to emerge through the objects and then get translated to us, that's when we started to see how this works. And this is the sort of space that we're trying to build now in Inventing Europe. And it needs a certain amount of gravity, it needs a certain amount of will, but I think if we take this idea forward, that what we're trying to do within this space is translate objects, and think about the ways that we too are walking across borders and moving between realms of knowledge, that's when where Inventing Europe can become a very important place to be. Thank you.